Chapter 5, For Cell, First Love. How is one to take the title of this chapter, A Cell and Love in the same breath? Oh well, probably it has to do with Leningrad during the blockade, and you were imprisoned in the big house. In that case, it would be very understandable. That's why you're still alive, because they shoved you in there. It was the best place in Leningrad, not only for the interrogators, who even lived there and had offices in the cellars in case of shelling. Joking aside, in Leningrad in those days, no one washed and everyone's face was covered with a black crust. But in the big house, prisoners were given a hot shower every 10th day. Well, it's true that only the corridors were heated for the jailers. The cells were left unheated. But after all, there were water pipes in the cells that worked and a toilet. And where else in Leningrad could you find that? And the bread ration was just like the ration outside, barely 4.5 ounces. In addition, there was broth made from slaughtered horses once a day, and thin gruel once a day as well. It was a case of the cats being envious of the dog's life. But what about punishment cells? And what about the supreme measure, execution? No, that isn't what this chapter title is about. Not at all. You sit down and half close your eyes and try to remember them all. How many different cells were you imprisoned in during your term? Is it difficult even to count them? And in each one there were people. There might have been 2 people in one, 150 in another. You were imprisoned for 5 minutes in one and all summer long in another. But in every case, out of all the cells you've been in, your first cell is a very special one. The place where you first encountered others like yourself, doomed to the same fate. All your life, you will remember it with an emotion that you otherwise experience only in remembering your first love. And those people who shared with you the floor and the air of that stone cubicle during those days when you rethought your entire life, will from time to time be recollected by you as members of your own family. Yes, in those days, they were your only family. What you experienced in your first interrogation cell parallels nothing in your entire previous life or your whole subsequent life. No doubt prisons have stood for thousands of years before you came along, and many continue to stand after you too, longer than one would like to think. But that first interrogation cell is unique and inimitable. Maybe it was a terrible place for a human being, an ice-laden, bed-bug-infested lockup without windows, without ventilation, without bunks, and with a dirty floor, a box called KCP in the village Soviet, at the police station, in the railroad station, or in some port. The KPZ, and the DPZs are scattered across the face of our land in the greatest abundance. There are mattresses of prisoners in them, or maybe it was solitary in the Archangel prison. Oh, there are masses of faith of our land. There are masses of prisoners in them, scattered across the face of our land. Gosh, I'm sorry. Or maybe it was solitary in the Archangel prison, where the glass had been smeared over with red lead so that the only rays of God's named light which crept into you were crimson, and where a 15-watt bulb burned constantly in the ceiling day and night. Or solitary in the city of Choibasan, where for 6 months at a time, 14 of you were crowded onto 7 square yards of floor space in such a way that you could only shift your bent legs in unison. or it was one of the Laportova psychological cells like number 111, which was painted black and also had a day and night 25-watt bulb, but was in all other respects like every other Laportova cell. Asphalt floor, the heating valve in the corridor where only the guards had access to it, and above all, that interminable irritating roar from the wind tunnel of the neighboring Central Aero and Hydrodynamic Institute. A roar one could not believe was unintentional, a roar which would make a bowl or cup vibrate so loudly that it would slip off the edge of the table, a roar which made it useless to converse, and during which one could sing at the top of one's lungs and the jailer wouldn't even hear. And then when the roar stopped, there would ensue a sense of relief and felicity superior to freedom itself. But it was not the dirty floor, nor the murky walls, nor the odor of the latrine bucket that you loved, but those fellow prisoners with whom you about faced at command, and the something which beat between your heart and theirs, and their sometimes astonishing words, and then too the birth within you on that very spot of free-floating thoughts you had so recently been unable to leap up or rise to, and how much it had cost you to last out in that until that first self. You had been kept in a pit, or in a box, or in a cellar. No one had addressed a human word to you. No one had looked at you with a human gaze. All they did was to peck at your brain and heart with iron beaks, and when you cried out or groaned, they laughed. For a week or a month, you had been an abandoned waif, alone among enemies, and you had already said goodbye to reason and to life, and you had already tried to kill yourself by falling from the radiator in such a way as to smash your brains against the iron cone of the valve. Then all of a sudden you were alive again, and were brought into your friends, and reason returned to you. That's what your first cell is. You waited for that cell. You dreamed of it almost as eagerly as a freedom. Meanwhile, they kept shoving you around between cracks in the walls and holes in the ground, from Laportova to some legendary, diabolical Sukhanovka. Sukhanovka was the most terrible prison the MGB had. Its very name was used to intimidate prisoners. Interrogators would hiss it threateningly, and you'd not be able to question those who had been there. Either they were insane and talking only disconnected nonsense, or they were dead. Sukhanovka was a former monastery dating back to Catherine the Great. It consisted of two buildings, one in which prisoners served out their terms, and the other a structure that contained 68 monk cells and was used for interrogations. The journey there in a Black Maria took 2 hours, and only a handful of people knew that the prison was really just a few miles from Lenin's Gorky estate and near the former estate of Zinaida Volkanskaya. The countryside surrounding was beautiful. There they stunned the newly arrived prisoner with a stand-up punishment cell again, so narrow that when he was no longer able to stand, he had to sag, supported by his bent knees and propped against a wall. There was no alternative. They kept prisoners thus for more than a day to break their resistance, but they ate tender, tasty food at Sukhanovka, which was like nothing else in the MGB, because it was brought in from the architect's rest home. They didn't maintain a separate kitchen to prepare hogwash. However, the amount one aircraft would eat, including fries and potatoes and meatballs, was divided among 12 prisoners. As a result, the prisoners were not always hungry, but also exceedingly irritable. The cells were built for two, but prisoners under interrogation were usually kept in them singly. The dimensions were 5 by 6 and a half feet. 2 little round stools were welded to the stone floor like stumps, and at night, if the guard unlocked a cylinder lock, a shelf dropped it from the wall onto each stump and remained there for 7 hours. In other words, during the 8 hours of interrogation, if there was no daytime interrogation at Sukhanovka at all. And a little straw mattress large enough for a child also dropped down. During the day, the stool was exposed and free, but one was forbidden to sit upon it. In addition, a table lay like an ironing board on 4 upright pipes. The fortochka in the window, the small hinged pane for ventilation, was always closed except for 10 minutes in the morning when the guard cranked it open. Is that the muzzle? The glass in the little window was reinforced. There were never any exercise periods out of doors. Prisoners were taken to the toilet at 6 a.m. only, i.e. when no one's stomach needed it. There was no toilet period in the evening. There were 2 guards for each block of 7 cells, so that was why the prisoners could be under almost constant inspection through the peephole, the only interruption being the time it took the guard to step past 2 doors to a third. And that was the purpose of silent Sukhanovka, to leave the prisoner not a single moment of sleep, not a single stolen moment of privacy. You were always being watched and always in their power. But if you endured the whole tour with insanity and all their trials of loneliness and had stood firm, you deserved your first self. And now when you got into it, your soul would heal. If you had surrendered, if you had given in and betrayed everyone, you were also ready for your first self, but it would have been better for you to not to have lived until that happy moment, and to have died a victor in the cellar, without having signed a single sheet of paper. Now, for the first time, you are about to see people who are not your enemies. Now, for the first time, you are about to see others who were alive, who were traveling your road, and whom you could join to yourself with the joyous word, we. Yes, that word, which you may have despised out in freedom, then when they used it as a substitute for your own individuality, quote, all of us like one man, or we are deeply angered, or we demand, or we swear, is now revealed to you as something sweet, as you are not alone in the world. Why, spiritual beings, human beings, still exist. I had been dueling for 4 days with the interrogator when the jailer, having waited until I lay down to sleep in my blindingly lit box, began to unlock my door. I heard him all right, but before he could say, "Get up, interrogation," I wanted to lie for another 300ths of a second, my head on the pillow, and pretended I was sleeping. But instead, the familiar command the guard ordered, "Get up, pick up your bedding." Uncomprehending and unhappy because this was my most precious time, I wound up on my footcloths, put on my boots, my overcoat, my winter cap, and clasped the government-issue mattress in my arms. The guard was walking on tiptoe and kept signaling not to make a noise as he led me down the corridor, silent as the grave, through the 4th floor of the Lubyanka, past the desk of the section supervisor, past the shiny numbers on the cells of the olive-covered doors of the peepholes, and unlocked cell 67. I entered, and he locked it behind me immediately. Even though only a quarter of an hour or so had passed since the signal to go to sleep had been given. The period allotted the prisoner for sleeping was so fragile and undependable. A brief time. By the time I arrived, the inhabitants of cell 67 were already asleep on their metal cots with their hands on top of the blankets. At the sound of the opening door, all three started to raise their heads for an instant. They too were waiting to learn which of them might be taken to interrogation. And those three lifted heads, those three unshaven, crumpled, pale faces, seemed to me so human, so dear, that I stood there, hugging my mattress, and smiled with happiness. And they smiled, and what a forgotten look it was, after only a week. Are you some freedom? They asked me. That was a question customarily put to a newcomer. No, I replied, and that was the newcomer's usual first reply. They had in mind, and I had probably been arrested recently, which meant that I came from freedom. And I, after 96 hours of interrogation, hardly considered that I was from freedom. Was I not already a veteran prisoner? Nonetheless, I was from freedom. The beardless old man with the black and very lively eyebrows was already asking me for military and political news. Astonishing. Even though it was late February, they knew nothing about the Yalta Conference, nor the encirclement of East Prussia, nor anything at all about our own attack below Warsaw in mid-January, nor even about the woeful December retreat of the Allies. According to regulations, those under interrogation were not supposed to know anything about the outside world, and here they indeed they didn't. I was prepared to spend half the night telling them all about it with pride, as though all the victories and advances were work of my own hands. But at this point, the duty jailer brought my cot, and I had to set it up without making a noise. I was helped by a young fellow of my own age, also a military man, and he was helped in his tunic and aviator's cap hung on his cuff. He asked me, even before the old man spoke, not for the news of the war, but for tobacco. But although I felt open-hearted, toward my new friends, and although not many words had been exchanged in the few minutes since I joined them, I sensed something alien in this frontline soldier who was my contemporary, and as far as he was concerned, I clammed up immediately and forever. I had not yet even heard of the word Nesedka, stool pigeon, nor learned that there had been one such stool pigeon in each cell, and I had not yet had time to think things over and conclude that I did not like this fellow, Georgy Kramarenko. But a sense of relay had glitched inside me, and it had closed him off from me for good and all. I would not bother to recall this, even if it had been the only one of its kind. But soon, with astonishment and alarm, I became aware of the work of this internal sense of relay as a constant inborn trait. The years passed as I lay on the same bunk, marched in the same formation, and worked in the same work brigades with hundreds of others, and always that secret sense of relay, whose certain creation I deserved not the least bit of credit, worked even before I remembered I was there, worked at the first line of a human face and eyes, at the first sound of a voice, And so I opened my heart to the person, either fully or just a little width of a crack, or just the width of a crack, or else shut myself off from him completely. This was so consistently unfailing that all the efforts of the state security officers to employ stool pigeons began to seem to me as insignificant as being pestered by gnats. After all, a person who has undertaken to be a traitor always betrays the fact in his face and in his voice, and even though they were more skilled in pretense, there was always something fishy about them. On the other hand, the sensor relay helped me to distinguish those from whom I could, from the very beginning of our acquaintance, completely disclose my most precious depths and secrets for which heads roll. Excuse me. Thus it was that I got through 8 years of imprisonment, 3 years of exile, and another 6 of underground authorship, which were no wise less dangerous. During all those 17 years, I recklessly revealed myself to dozens of people and didn't make a misstep even once. I have never once read about this trait anywhere, and I mention it here for those interested in psychology. It seems to me that such spiritual sensors exist in many of us, but because we live in too technological and rational an age, we neglect this as a miracle and don't allow it to develop. We set up the cot, and I was ready to talk, in a whisper, of course, and lying down so as not to be sent from this cozy nest into a punishment cell. But our third cellmate, a middle-aged man whose cropped head already showered the white bristles of imminent grayness, peered at me discontentedly and said with an characteristic northern sensitivity, "Tomorrow night is for sleeping." That was the most intelligent thing to do. At any minute, one of us could have been pulled out for interrogation and held until 6 a.m., when the interrogator would go home and sleep, but we were forbidden to go. One night of undisturbed sleep was more important than all the fates of earth. One more thing held me back, which I didn't quite catch right away, but had felt nonetheless from the first words of my story, although I could not at this early date find a name for it. As each of us had been arrested, everything in our world had switched places. A 180-degree shift in all our concepts had occurred, and the good news I had begun to recount with such enthusiasm might not be good news for us at all. My cellmates turned on their sides, covered their ears with my handkerchiefs to keep the light out from the 200-watt light bulb, wound towels round their upper arms, which were chilled from lying on top of the blanket, with their lower arms furtively beneath them, and went to sleep. As I lay there, filled to the brim with the joy of being among them, 1 hour ago I could not have counted on being with anyone. I could have come to my end with a bullet in the back of my head, which was what the interrogator kept promising me, without having seen anyone at all. Interrogation still hung over me, but how far had it retreated? How far it had retreated. Tomorrow I would be telling them my story, though not talking about my case, of course, and they would be telling me their stories too. How interesting tomorrow would be on the best days, one of the best days of my life. Thus, very easy and very clearly, I had this consciousness that prison was not an abyss for me, but the most important turning point in my life. Every detail of the cell interested me. Sleep fled, and when the peephole was not in use, I studied it all furtively. Up there, at the top of the wall, was a small indentation the length of a 3 brick, covered by a dark blue paper blind. They had already told me it was a window. Yes, there was a window in the cell, and the blind served as an air-raid blackout. Tomorrow there would be weak daylight, and in the middle of the day they would turn off the glaring light bulb. How much that meant, how to have daylight in daytime. There was also a table in the cell. On it, in the most conspicuous spot, were a teapot, a chess set, a small pile of books. I was not yet aware of why they were so conspicuously positioned. It turned out to be another example of the Libyanka system at work. During his once-a-minute peephole inspection, the jailer was supposed to make sure that all the gifts of the prison administration were not being misused, that the teapot was not being used to break down the wall, that no one was swallowing their chessmen and thereby possibly cashing in his chips, and ceasing to be a citizen of the USSR, and that no one was starting a fire with the books in the hopes of burning down the whole prison, and a prisoner's eyes were considered so potentially dangerous that they were not allowed to remain on the table during the night. The prison administration took them away until morning. Excuse me. What a cozy life. Chess books, cots with springs, decent mattress, clean linen. I could not remember what having slept like this during the whole war. There was a worn parquet floor. One could take nearly 4 strides from window to door in the aisle between the cots, though indeed the Central Political Prison was a real resort. And no shells were falling. I remembered their sounds, the high-pitched sobbing way up overhead, then the rising whistle and the crash as they burst, and how tenderly the mortar shells whistled, and how everything trembled from the 4 blasts of what we called Dr. Goebbels' mortar rockers. And I remembered the wet snow and mud near Wounded, where I had been arrested, which our men were still wading through to keep the Germans from breaking out of our encirclement. All right then, the hell with you. If you don't want me to fight, I won't. Sorry about my tongue twister. I don't know why I can't read. Thank you for listening. I'll talk to you again. Bye. Good night.